All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for joining me for this conversation today. And I appreciate very much the time that you have. I wanted just to start by just asking you to talk a little bit about yourself, where you're from, if you grew up somewhere other than Colorado, when you moved out here, what made you come out to Colorado, or what keeps you here if you were born and raised here.
Awesome, and thank you, Andy, for having me. So I grew up in Northern California, um, and born and raised in the same small suburb of San Jose, and um, lived out there for just about 31 years. Went to college in Los Angeles, studied political science, and have really what brought me out to Colorado was that I was working at a nonprofit at the time in 2015, starting in 2014, 2015. And we had the opportunity to come out for an accelerator program in Boulder called Techstars to work on high skilled immigration policy. It was through the organization is called Global EIR. And took that opportunity, came out, absolutely loved it. And then I spent some time both there and made friends who were down here in Denver. And after a year of getting to know some really incredible people up in Boulder and friends that I see on a pretty regular basis, moved down to be in part as a member closer to the large we have down here. Um, and and have lived in central Denver, in downtown, ever since. Um, in terms of what's here, I would say it's the community that I've found and the people that I've had in life as a result of living in Denver. It's a really special place and a really incredible, engaged civic life, and just a lot of really wonderful who make it be. So
That makes, I mean, most folks really, grew up somewhere else and moved out here. It's always interesting to me too, kind of, then how that informs our experiences, right, of how we see living in Denver and, compare it. So tell me a little bit about your experience living in Denver with transit, both here and Boulder as well. I mean, in Colorado generally, and also other places that you might have lived. How does Denver kind of compare transit-wise to the other experiences you've had?
question. So I gave up my car when I moved out to Colorado. I'd been wanting to do that in the Bay Area for a few years. There are definitely parts of the country where driving is a wonderful and pleasant experience. Silicon Valley is not the most fun. It's a lot of traffic and not just a bunch of suburbs. So I knew I had wanted to move in that direction for a few years before I moved to Colorado, and I decided, hey, I'll give it a shot, and if I need to buy a car a year after I get there to get around, then I'll do that. But 7 years by RTD, walking, and occasionally taking Uber when there was really other good option. And it's worked for me really well. There are obviously times when it's difficult to lack any access to transit, and there are events that I've just not gone to because they were too far away from anything I go to. And there are things that you see something on Craigslist or you see something on Facebook Marketplace, and you're like, oh, that would go well in my apartment, but I don't have an easy way to go pick it up because I don't have a car. So there are sacrifices that I've made, in that way. Not major sacrifices, obviously, but things that trade-offs that have come as a result. And but all in all, it is dramatically cheaper. I spend maybe $300 or less a month on transit, and that's on a very Uber heavy month. When I owned a car, gas plus insurance plus all of these other costs that go in parking, I was spending at least double that. And, and so I've been incredibly happy with that choice, and it's worked out quite well.
And part of that as well, that choice, I mean, definitely has to do with where you choose to live. So then, you're residing in District A. Talk a little bit about kind of how the transit experience in District A is different versus other parts of the regional transportation district, where, of course, you've lived, in places like Boulder, for instance.
100%. Um, I think that the the transportation when you're car free or car light, depending upon how you think about it, because obviously I have access to ride sharing. Um, you are limited. Your sort of scope of the world is limited by your access to transit. And so, when I was living in Boulder, there were a handful of transit lines that I would rely on and that I would take on a regular basis. And the places that I would go in the year and a half that I was in Boulder were almost entirely scoped based on that. And so it didn't feel terribly small because there were a number of things there were a lot of coffee shops and there were venues and there were all of these things. But there were definitely large parts of the city that were just completely off limits to me because there weren't uh, tons of transit lines. And obviously, getting outside of that to other parts of Boulder County, were even more difficult. And so, living in central Denver, I live right on 17th Street. So there is a 15 bus stop I can see from my look down from my apartment building, and I can walk to the light rail. So it just opens up a network of places that I previously just would not have factored into my daily life because they weren't available. They weren't accessible to me unless I wanted to spend 30, 40, $50 each way to go there, which, you've got to have a pretty good reason for doing that. And so, it's given me a much broader appreciation of the city, county, metro area that we live in, to be lucky enough to live in a place like this.
And then kind of the inverse of the question, the transit experience. Well, what distinguishes, how do you see transit riders and voters in District A versus other parts of the district? It's not at wide. It is just kind of this is a district race. So what kind of makes District A different?
Totally. So I think the thing that District A is one of the more upper income districts out of the 15. It is one of the less diverse districts out of the 15. Um, it has a significant percentage of recent transplants because of the fact that it includes neighborhoods like Upper Downtown, Golden Triangle, Civic Center, Wash Park, Cap Hill, North Cap Hill. But it also has a ton of Denver's long-term residents and folks who've, built their lives here, their communities here, have become, some of the, you know, more established members of the community, and more financially successful in neighborhoods like Hilltop, Cherry Creek, Belcaro, on the east side of the district. So there are some interesting challenges that result from that because the west side of the district is perhaps one of the most transit friendly audiences. When you look at like who the most, heavily users of transit are for people in the district. And then you have folks who are maybe less inclined, but for whom, there's still a good amount of transit running through those neighborhoods, in part because it's the way that those routes get to Aurora. And so, there's interesting, it raises a lot of complex challenges in asking how can you effectively offer transit lines and transit service that the people in those neighborhoods will value, will want to use, and that people who want to, visit different parts of the district will value and will want to use. We have incredible parks in District A. We have Wash Park, we have Cheeseman, we have the Botanic Gardens, we have Cherry Creek Mall. So there's lots of reasons people want to come to District A, to say nothing of, upper downtown, Capitol. And so there's just a lot of really interesting complexities that come about as a result of that.
And then, what motivates you to run for RTD? What do you see yourself bringing to the board that you don't see on the board right now? And how do you kind of feel about representing District A?
Sure. I think the thing for me that really resonated um, is the opportunity that RTD has to make significant improvements in the way that it operates as a system, in ways that do not cost a ton of money and they do not scale in cost in the same way that, for example, scaling up service would. It is very expensive to hire 500 new bus drivers and put a bunch of new service on the road. It is a lot cheaper to figure out what can motivate people, what barriers can we eliminate to get people to use the services we are already offering, or to highlight services and adjust the services that we're offering in order to put that capacity to better use. I'm an analytical individual. I learned to code when I was 13 years old and have written a good amount of software in my professional life. And so, when I see things like the lack of QR codes on every bus stop that let you easily figure out when the next bus is going to come, when I see data feeds between RTD and the various apps that we have that are not always as reliable as I would like them to be, in order to help me determine whether or not my bus is actually coming or not. Um, I see problems that can have a major impact on people's lives, and that with concerted effort, we can meaningfully fix. Another example of that, when you go to New York, when you go to most of Europe, you can tap your credit card to pay for transit. And one of the major barriers that I strongly believe is a reason why people don't use PD is because they don't have an easy way to pay for it. They don't have cash. They don't know how much cash they need to pay. And if they can just tap a thing, regardless of who they are, regardless of if they've ever used it before, then they'll be much more likely to get on transit. And we've seen RTD has the hardware to implement CEMV, contactless tap to pay credit cards. And I think that we just need individuals on the board who are laser focused on some of those critical barriers to ease of use, to reliability, and to safety, that are not necessarily just asking, how much more money the ridership to get the frequency up, so that people will want to use it. We do need to do that, and I absolutely support RTD finding additional sources of funding, but not having those resources is not an excuse for solving the other problems, and really digging into why people aren't getting on the bus.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings us nicely to, my next section where I'm just sort of interested in understanding kind of, a lot of steps have been taken in the last couple of years. You mentioned, the hardware that RTD's installed, and I would say not just the hardware, but I'll kind of ask this question a little early, the new fare scheme, intelligibility that people can know what they're sort of looking at when they look at a map. They know how much it costs basically to get from A to B. I mean, if they're not going to the airport, it costs 275. So that's how much. And so some of these kind of efforts, like for instance, RTD's new fare scheme, tell me a little bit, like if you had been on the board at that time, would you have supported that kind of effort? Why not? What would that have been for you?
100%. That's an easy one. I think that it is a significant step forward from where we were, and I think that things like the fare capping policy that has gone along with it um, are a meaningful way to increase access to transit, to increase equity, um, and to encourage people who otherwise might have been occasional riders to become full-time riders, or who, might have felt like it was too expensive or too cumbersome with fares that could go all over the place, to just be able to have predictability. I think that that predictability is extraordinarily important. But I will say we still have a long way to go. I was on the train back from the airport yesterday, sitting next to a United Airlines employee who was telling me that she drives to work, or rather, not, that she has a car, but that she prefers to take the train, to walk and take the train from 61st and Pena. And that because they only give her $36 worth of vouchers, she ends up having to go out and buy the monthly pass, despite the fact that she works full time at the airport. If we are not coming up with fare structures and working on partnerships with major employers such that every single person at the airport has an unlimited RTD pass, then we are failing at some pretty obvious ways to increase access to transit. So I think the new fare scheme is a starting point in how we should be thinking about increasing the ways that people are going to be able to afford and to pay for transit, and just that first step in reducing that barrier to entry, and those making it easier for people to get on.
It has definitely been a consequential time on the board. Somewhat recently, all of these questions they're going to ask you next, it just happened in the last couple of years. I think just like the fare scheme, another thing that people can feel and think about, is their actual sort of bus route that they take all the time, and how frequently it comes, when it starts in the morning, when it ends at night. And so some, people would have been paying quite a lot of attention to this in 2022, RTD's system optimization plan, which made a lot of recommendations about routes to focus on, kind of core routes, connect routes, community routes. They have kind of a whole lingo there around how to think about frequency and, who's being served by those routes. Um, you know, Briefly, are you in favor of the service optimization plan that RTD adopted in 2022? Do you see something that works there? Why or why not?
Totally. So I'll preface this by saying that I have read the SOP and I am reasonably familiar with it. I am not as familiar as I would have wanted to be if I were voting on it back then, and have sort of done the in-depth homework. But based on my appreciation of it, based on the conversations that I've had about it, I feel very confident that it was the right uh, step forward, and that RTD, where it is, um, we we have to have meaningful conversations about the right way to offer reliable transit service that people want to use. And we have to have real conversations about the impacts that come when we choose to run routes that do not have a significant amount of ridership um, over those that have meaningfully more demand. Um, Obviously, issues around equity, whenever you're having this kind of a conversation, are absolutely paramount. And the notion but I guess what I would say is the notion that trading off coverage for the frequency, I think frequency has its own equity benefits because you can offer significantly higher quality service to communities, underrepresented communities, which are receiving that. And I think that the SOP did a good job of moving in that direction while still taking significant equity concerns into account. But I think we need to keep having that conversation because what people want is service they want to use. And to be quite frank, we have such a large service area with the amount of money that RTD has, it is never going to be possible for us to offer high frequency, you know, service to every single neighborhood in the district. It is simply not an economic or physical reality for us to be able to do that. And so we have to have genuine, complex, hard conversations, political conversations with stakeholders from across the district to figure out how we can offer the best service possible that people will use to communities that are funding this. And that's not necessarily easy, but we can't shy away from it. And I think the SOP was, it was done out of necessity. I'm not sure it would have happened without the pandemic, but that kind of thing, that kind of thinking and that kind of conversation needs to keep on going.
Another conversation I think that is definitely still going in many ways. There was last year a update to code of conduct, from passengers. There was a lot of press coverage about it. That pretty kind of contentious seemed even in the moment as it was passing on the board. How did you feel about, RTD's respect the ride, code of conduct updates? Would you have voted to approve those, that were approved in 2023?
So obviously, I think if I had been on the board, it's almost certain that the language in there would have been different just from having had my opportunity to have an input on it. But what I would say, to speak more broadly, is I think that the I think that safety is about making sure that everyone feels safe on transit when they are using it to get from point A to point B. That is the job of the agency, is to provide a means of transport from your origin to your destination in a manner where you feel comfortable being on there. And that comfort can't come, to be clear, at the sake of making someone else feel uncomfortable. And that's the tension that we run into often with these conversations. And so to me, I think that, how can I put this? Everyone knows what transit should look like. Everyone knows how we want a healthy and safe ride on transit to feel like. It's what you do in the situations where that sort of common understanding and comity, comity, breaks down. And suddenly you have someone who is harassing another person, or you have someone who is, using drugs, or you have someone who is being, significantly disruptive. And you start to ask the question of, like, whose responsibility to deal with that, if anyone. I appreciated that we had the conversation. I think that we do need meaningful updates, but I also think that having those changes without having a means to make them a reality is just words on a page. And so, I've said for started running that, to me, we RTD needs a presence of individuals across the system not necessarily officers, but people who can serve as ambassadors. I was just in Boston, and they have wonderful transit ambassadors who sit on the buses, who stand at the stations, help direct people around. They don't have a gun. They don't have a baton, any of that. They do have a radio if they need to reach someone, and there are transit officers at the stations and people who can intervene in those situations. But in every situation I've ever been in 7 years on it, I have never found myself feeling like I needed an officer with a gun to deal with that situation, which is not to say that those situations do not exist. They do every single day. RTD serves hundreds of thousands of people every single day. You're going to have situations like that. But for the day-to-day occurrences where someone is, you know, behaving in a manner that makes it difficult for someone else to feel safe riding transit, having people who can say, hey, you got to not harass this person. Hey, you need to cool down a little bit. Hey, comma, can I get you some help? Do you need a place to go sleep? Hey, let's take you to a clinic. You don't look so good. Um, those those people will make transit feel safer. And this is really important, they offer drivers a way to not have to also be handling those sorts of disturbances. And one of the biggest reasons that I've heard from the folks at ATU about why we have trouble recruiting and sorry, retaining the great people we have as operators is because we're asking them to do double duty, and it's not reasonable. And so I want to see us hiring people like that, putting them in a position where they can be helpful, partnering, by the way, with community to find people, because quite honestly, it's really important that the people who are on these buses can come from the communities that they're serving and can speak, in when you're running buses in communities of color, you need to have the skills to speak Spanish or to relate to people. And I think we can do that. I think it's possible. I think other transit organizations and government have done it. We just have, it's important, and we have to be willing to experiment and try new things and what doesn't. So that's sort of how I look at that question.
And then, I think you've already touched on this, but then there was a recent, they confirmed a new sort of police chief for RTD's transit police. And then recently, the board voted to approve more money to hire more officers for RTD's transit police. Would you have voted for an expansion like that?
I would. And the reason that I say that is that I think that, you know, like we have a very, very big service area to cover, a significantly massive service area. Um, and one of the things that I've looked at statistically, when you compare the record of the RTD police to that of the record of pretty much every other police agency in the metro area, RTD has meaningfully fewer, significant violations, conduct violations. And I think a part of that is just that if you're a transit police officer, you don't face the same kinds of situations that you do if you're DPD. It is unlikely that you are going to have to be sending officers running into, a bank robbery or dealing with any number of other extremely violent situations where, the training just looks significantly different. So I think that, we should be very prepared to have officers available when there are situations that warrant the engagement of an armed officer. I think people want to know that someone will be there. And I think that we are safer as a transit going public to have police officers that specifically train to deal with those issues than we are asking, officers from whatever county, whatever city the bus happens to be in at that point to be the first responders. That's obviously going to happen some of the time, but I think genuinely the riders of RTD will be safer. That being said, I think the goal should be to try to ensure that that type of intervention is as limited as possible, and that we use other resources like, you know, ambassadors and similar de-escalation opportunities, so that we're not sending cops into every situation where two people start having beef, or where someone is having a mental health crisis. That's not what we should be using armed officers for.
Yeah, no, and it's, of course, it's a sensitive conversation. I'm sure it'll continue. It'll be an interesting thing to see, people continue to voice that, whatever that vision might be for RTD. Thinking a little bit ahead, imagine that you are on the board. What do you think the next big project RTD needs to take on, and how do you see board members pushing that?
So I think there's two pieces. I there so there like I said, I come from Northern California, from Silicon Valley, and when I was a kid, teenager, I used Mac OS, and at one point, Mac OS 10.5 came out, was Leopard, and then Mac OS 10.6 came out, and that was Snow Leopard. I believe I've got that right. And noteworthy thing with Snow Leopard was, after so many years of adding new features to Mac OS, Snow Leopard, Steve Jobs got up there and said, "This OS has no new features. We are fixing everything under the hood, but we are not adding a single new feature to this OS." And I think that RTD is in a period like that right now. I don't see us adding a bunch of new, light rail lines anytime soon. I don't know necessarily that we're going to go out and get a ton of new funding for doubling the bus system. But even if we do, the goal should be get the system back to good order. Do the maintenance, do the updates to wayfinding, fix the paint at the stations, so that when you walk around, the lights work and they look nice and it feels comfortable and safe to wait there for your train. It's not sexy, but having a system that people want to spend time in is critically important to making this great amount of service that we run something people want to actually use. And so, I don't know that that's been a high priority at RTD for a long time. When I walk around some of the light rail stations, when I walk around some of the bus stops, it doesn't feel like that they care about that experience side of it. But I think we can, and I think we can do dramatically better. More bus stops need trash cans, more bus stops need benches, shade. These are solvable problems, and they just require us to really dig in on something that, again, otherwise is not always the most sexy thing at play.
And then, that's an interesting perspective then, because my other kind of question is, there's a couple fast tracks projects remaining, and some of them by some very powerful folks here in Colorado are being kind of constantly trumpeted as essential projects that have to be completed. Given a limited resources, given, the fact, or not given unlimited, excuse me, given the limit to resources that you have, are there any that you see really as essential or to prioritize in that kind of era of expansion that still remains?
We are about to run out of time. Do you want to pause your recording and restart the Zoom?
Yeah, I'm thinking a little bit about it. I don't think we have to hit every single question. I think if we can try and answer this one and then just say a closing message, I think that's fine to me.
Okay. Uh, at until we deliver the line, um, that will hang as a millstone around our neck forever. And I think that if Front Range Rail passes, that primary focus. Um, if it does not, if we go to the ballot and voters say no, I think that on the back and focusing the remaining uh, pieces is the right move. So I sort of leave it up to what is pragmatic and what is politically possible. Without FRPR, the B line's just never going to happen.
Yeah, no, and I think, yeah, I think that's an opinion shared by quite a few folks right at the moment. That's an interesting one. So just, in brief, tell us just really quickly, I'm a voter. I actually am not in District A, but if I were a voter in District A, why should I vote for Chris for RTD?
Great question. Um, so as someone who is a transit dependent um, individual, as someone with 2 decades of policy experience and relationships across the metro area, I believe I bring a unique set of skills and relationships to the board. I think a lot of the problems that we are going to be solving in the region around transportation are going to require stronger partnerships between RTD and the state and the various metro areas and the municipalities. And I think that, as someone who has worked in politics and who has the endorsements of 4 members of the city council, who has the endorsement of the mayor of Boulder, who has the endorsement of, as of today, my predecessor, or rather the person who's been holding the office, Kate Williams, for the last 7 years, which I'm deeply honored by her support. I think that, those relationships are what allow you at the end of the day to make big things happen and to build on the systems that we have right now. RTD can't solve its problems alone. It has to work with others. And I have a proven record of being able to do that.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for your time. This has been really interesting. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much, Andy.